New Zealand has a problem. A strong magnitude 5.9 just struck one of the most sensitive stretches of ground in the entire country. And guys, I need to be honest with you right away. This is not a random shake. This is not bad luck. This is the same machine I've been warning you about. And it just fired again. Boff. That's the headline today. So just a few days ago, we sat here and we talked about a magnitude 5.7 that hit right next to Lake Taupo, right under that super volcano, right in that stretching rift zone. And I told you, guys, watch this region because it's loaded. It's geologically loaded. And I know some of you in the comments said, okay, she's being dramatic. Well, I wish I was. Because early Saturday morning, while most of the country was asleep, the ground let go again. And this time it wasn't a 5.7. This time it was a 5.9. Severe shaking, right in the middle of the North Island, right next to the same volcanic system I told you to watch. So let's get into it because there's a lot to unpack here, and some of it is honestly more unsettling than the first one. New Zealand, I keep saying it, beautiful country. Absolutely beautiful. Green hills, rivers, volcanoes, all of it. But guys, beauty like that always comes from something underneath. It comes from tectonic violence, from plates grinding, from crust splitting apart over millions of years. That's how you get the scenery. But that's also how you get mornings like this one. So here's what we know for certain. Straight from GeoNet, New Zealand's own earthquake monitoring agency. Early Saturday morning, 4:51 a.m. local time, a magnitude 5.9 earthquake struck about 5 kilometers south of the town of Taumarunui. That's in the King Country, central North Island. GeoNet classified the shaking as severe. Severe, guys. Not moderate, not light. Severe. That's the category where furniture walks across the floor, where things fall off shelves, where older buildings can pick up real damage. Now hold on to this next number, because just like last time, it's the number that changes the entire story. Depth, 9 kilometers, 9. That is shallow. That is very shallow for an earthquake of this size in this part of the country. And I'm going to explain exactly why that matters in a minute, because it's the difference between a quake that shakes a small radius and a quake that wakes up an entire nation. And that's exactly what happened. This thing was felt across Waikato, Bay of Plenty, Taranaki, Manawatu, all the way down to Wellington, and even parts of the South Island. Within hours, more than 22,000 people had logged felt reports with GeoNet. 22,000 people from one earthquake. People in Auckland felt their beds shake. People near Tarangi, which you'll remember from the last video, described it like being in a bowl of jelly. That's a direct quote from someone in the comments on a local news story, and honestly, that's about as good a description of an earthquake as I've ever heard. So what actually happened on the ground? Well, thankfully, and I want to say this clearly up front because I know some of you get anxious watching these videos, there are no reports of serious injuries, no major structural collapse. A couple of commercial buildings in Taumarunui had glass break. A secondhand shop had vases and stocks smashed on the floor. Minor slips came down on some rain-soaked roads in the district, closing a couple of highways temporarily, though heavy overnight rain shares some of the blame there too, not just the quake. Power, water, and communications in the area were reported as normal. So this is not a disaster story. I want to be honest with you about that. But it is a warning story, and those are two very different things. Now let's talk aftershocks, because this is where it gets interesting. Within the first couple of hours, GeoNet had already logged multiple aftershocks in the magnitude 2 to 4 range rattling around the same patch of ground. By the next day, a seismologist from Earth Sciences New Zealand said the count had climbed to nearly 80 aftershocks. 80 in less than a day. That tells you something important. It tells you the fault that ruptured is still adjusting, still settling, still working through the stress it just released. Scientists say this pattern of aftershocks is expected to continue for weeks, possibly months, gradually shrinking in size and frequency. Normal. But also, guys, a reminder that the ground under that part of the North Island is still very much alive right now. Local emergency management put out the same message you'll hear after every one of these events, and it's worth repeating because it actually saves lives. If you feel an aftershock, drop, cover, and hold. And if you're already in bed when one hits, the advice is simple. Stay there, pull a pillow over your head and neck, and ride it out rather than running blind through a dark house. Boring advice, I know. But boring advice is exactly what keeps a broken vase from becoming a broken skull. And Taumarunui itself, for those of you who don't know the geography, it's a small town, just a few thousand people, sitting where the Ongarue and Whanganui rivers meet in the Ruapehu district. It's the kind of place most people outside New Zealand have never heard of, right up until the ground underneath it decides to make headlines. One resident, from what I saw in the local reporting, said they got off lightly, that it looked worse than it actually was once the cleanup started. And that's often exactly how these moderate, shallow quakes go. Loud, frightening, a lot of broken glass and fallen shelves. but not the structural nightmare that a slower building, much larger rupture would bring. And before I keep going, I do want to say something because it's relevant every single time I cover one of these events. There are channels out there right now, and I mean dozens of them, that take reporting like this, run it through an AI voice, slap a fake talking head on it, and repost it within hours, pretending it's their own original coverage. If a channel never shows an actual live face, never does a real live stream where you can see them respond in real time, be careful. It's become a genuine problem across this platform. Bot farms basically farming real analysis and repackaging it with exaggerated claims bolted on. I'm telling you this because when it comes to something as serious as earthquake risk, you want your information coming from somewhere that's actually done the work, not somewhere that scraped it. So now let's get into the why, because this is the part that most channels are going to skip right past, and it's the part that actually matters. Why did this happen right here? Why did it happen at this depth? And why does it keep happening in this exact stretch of the North Island? So Tamaru Nui sits right on the edge of one of the most geologically active features on Earth, the Taupo volcanic zone. Same system as last time. Same stretching, splitting, pulling apart zone that runs straight through the center of the North Island. I described it last time as pizza dough being pulled in two directions. And I'm going to stick with that image because it works. The crust here is being stretched thin by forces coming from deep underground, ultimately connected to the Pacific plate, diving down and sinking beneath the North Island. As that stretching happens, the crust doesn't just thin out quietly, it cracks. Blocks of ground drop down along what geologists call normal faults. That's the technical term, normal faulting. Extension, the ground pulling apart and slipping down along a crack. And that's exactly what GeoNet says happened here. Their own statement on this earthquake describes it as normal faulting, extension of the crust in the upper part of the Australian plate, right at the edge of the Taupo volcanic zone, where the crust is thinning because of the Pacific plate subducting below. Same story, same mechanism as the 5.7 by Lake Taupo, different spot on the same machine. Now here's the part that should catch your attention. This was not a deep quake, and in this particular district, that is genuinely unusual. Most of the big earthquakes that strike under the central King Country happen far, far below the surface, inside the slab of Pacific plate that's sinking beneath the island. For comparison, there was a magnitude 6.2 back in 2018 that struck beneath roughly the same part of the King Country, only about 20 kilometers from Saturday's epicenter. That one ruptured 207 kilometers down. 207. When a quake happens that deep, the energy has to travel an enormous distance before it reaches the surface. And by the time it does, it's spread out and softened across a huge area. People feel a gentle roll, nothing dramatic. This one was 9 kilometers deep. 9, compared to 207. That is basically right underneath people's feet in geological terms. A rupture that shallow sends its energy almost straight up into the town sitting above it, with none of that natural softening. That's exactly why the shaking was described as severe close to the epicenter, why people were thrown out of bed at 4:51 in the morning, and why the felt reports stretched from one end of the North Island to the other. Same magnitude, roughly, as some other quakes this district has seen. Completely different experience on the ground, purely because of where it happened. Depth changes everything. I told you that last time, and here we are again. Think of it this way, guys. Imagine someone knocking on a door from right outside versus someone knocking on that same door from 200 meters down a hallway with 3 closed rooms in between. Same knock, same force, completely different experience, depending on where you're standing. That's what depth does to an earthquake. A deep rupture spreads its energy out like ripples across a huge pond before it ever reaches you. Softened, diffuse, barely noticeable, unless you're paying close attention. A shallow rupture, 9 kilometers, is basically knocking directly on the floor beneath people's beds. That's why this one produced 22,000 felt reports and a couple of towns worth of broken glass, while the deeper quake of similar or even larger magnitude in the same general area might pass with barely a mention. So naturally, the question everyone starts asking is the volcano question, because Ruapehu sits only around 55 kilometers away. And Taupo, the supervolcano, isn't that far off either. So is this the mountain waking up? No. And I'll give you the honest, straight answer just like I did last time. This was a tectonic earthquake. Rock breaking cleanly along a fault line, driven by the stretching of the crust. It was not magma forcing its way upward. If this had been volcanic in origin, you would expect a completely different signature. You'd expect swarms of small, shallow, repetitive quakes clustered right under the vent. Harmonic tremor. A messy, drawn-out signal that looks nothing like a single sharp rupture. This was one clean, sudden release of built-up tectonic stress. That is a textbook rift earthquake, not a volcanic one. So take a breath. Nobody is saying Ruapehu or Taupo is about to erupt because of this. But, and here's the honest caveat I have to give you, because I'm not going to sugarcoat it. In a rift system like this, faulting and volcanism are cousins. They're driven by the same underlying process. The same stretching that snaps a fault and produces an earthquake like this one is, over long timescales, the same stretching that thins the crust enough to let magma rise more easily elsewhere in the system. So this earthquake by itself is not a volcanic alarm. But it is one more sign of just how loaded, how stretched, how mechanically active this whole central section of the North Island really is right now. Two things can be true at once. It's not volcanic, and the region is still one of the most geologically stressed places on the planet. Now let's zoom out, because I promised you last time that these events don't exist in isolation, and this one doesn't either. Just over a week before this quake hit Taumarunui, a separate magnitude 5.9 struck near Teanau, way down on the South Island, close to Fiordland. That one was deeper, roughly 40 to 50 kilometers down, and it actually triggered a brief tsunami warning for the west coast before it was lifted. Different fault system, different island, but same underlying story. New Zealand sits directly on top of the boundary between the Pacific Plate and the Australian Plate, and right now, across multiple segments of that boundary, from Fiordland in the south to the Kermadec Trench in the north to this rift zone running straight through the middle of the North Island, the ground has been active. Genuinely active. Not calm. So think about the picture we're building here. In the space of about a week and a half, you've got a 5.9 near Teanau in the south, a 5.7 right by Lake Taupo in the center, an offshore swarm rattling the Kermadec Trench to the north, and now a 5.9 near Taumarunui, practically next door to that first Taupo quake. That is not four unrelated stories. That is one country, sitting on one enormously active plate boundary, having an unusually busy stretch. And I want to be careful here, because busy doesn't automatically mean catastrophic. New Zealand experiences thousands of earthquakes every single year, most of them too small to feel. But when you get this many moderate to strong events clustering across multiple regions in such a short window, it's worth paying attention. It's worth talking about honestly, without either panicking you or pretending nothing is happening. Because here's the thing people forget when they look at any one of these quakes in isolation. New Zealand doesn't sit on one single fault the way some places do. It sits astride an entire boundary where two massive tectonic plates are constantly renegotiating their relationship, sliding, colliding, tearing, subducting, all along the same 1,800-kilometer stretch of country. Every one of these events, Teanau, Taupo, Taumarunui, the Kermadecs, is a different chapter being written on a different page of the same book. They're not coordinated. One doesn't reach out and trigger the next in some domino effect you need to be afraid of. But they are all symptoms of the same underlying tension, and that's exactly why I think it's worth tracking them together instead of treating each headline as its own isolated, disconnected event. So let's answer the question you actually clicked for. Is this the big one? Is Taumarunui, is this 5.9 some kind of forerunner to something much bigger? Almost certainly not, at least not in the sense of this specific quake being a foreshock. The overwhelming majority of earthquakes this size are standalone events. They rupture a section of fault, they release the stress that had built up there, and then that particular patch goes quiet for a while as the aftershock sequence works itself out, which, remember, seismologists expect to continue for weeks or months here, gradually fading. That's normal. That's the ground doing exactly what it's supposed to do after a moderate rupture like this. But here's the layer underneath that answer, the same honest layer I gave you last time. The reason events like this keep happening in New Zealand isn't bad luck, and it isn't some hidden buildup toward one specific date. It's the plate boundary itself. New Zealand sits directly on top of one of the most active plate boundaries on Earth. It is built to produce earthquakes. Regularly, that's simply what this landscape does. The same way it grows volcanoes and geothermal fields and some of the most dramatic scenery on the planet. The Hikurangi subduction zone off the east coast of the North Island remains capable of producing something in the magnitude 8 range with a fast-moving tsunami. The Alpine Fault down the South Island still carries one of the highest odds of any fault on Earth for a major rupture within the coming decades. Neither of those had anything to do with what happened at Taumarunui. This was a shallow, local, rift-related quake. But they're both still sitting there, loaded, patient, part of the same overall system. So here's how I'd sum it up, honestly, no exaggeration. Saturday's quake was strong, it was shallow, and it was widely felt, which made it feel much bigger on the ground than its magnitude alone would suggest. It came from ordinary, well-understood rift faulting at the edge of the Taupo volcanic zone, not from volcanic unrest. It was not connected to any single bigger rupture building toward some future date. But it is one more data point in a genuinely active stretch across the entire New Zealand plate boundary, from Fiordland to the Kermadec to the middle of the North Island. And that's why I keep coming back to this topic, guys, not to scare you, but because I think you deserve the honest, layered version of the story instead of a headline that just says, "The ground shook." And I do want to say this to my viewers who actually live there, in Taumarunui, in the King Country, in Tarangi, anywhere across the central North Island. You already live in one of the best prepared earthquake countries on the planet. Building codes here are strict. Emergency management response was fast. Roads were checked at first light. People knew exactly what to do: drop, cover, hold, and stay where you are if you're in bed. That kind of preparedness matters enormously, and it's a big part of why an earthquake this strong produced broken glass and smashed vases instead of anything worse. And I say this every time I cover New Zealand, but it bears repeating because the contrast matters. This is one of the best prepared earthquake nations on the planet, right alongside Japan. They know exactly what they're sitting on. They teach it in schools, they build for it, and they respond to it fast. Towers in downtown Vancouver, parts of Seattle, parts of Portland, all sitting on soil and in buildings that were never designed with something like that in mind. New Zealand doesn't have that problem. They know, they plan, they drill for it. That doesn't mean the risk disappears, but it means when the ground moves, like it did Saturday morning, the system responds instead of scrambling. If you're watching this from that part of New Zealand, tell me in the comments, did you feel it? Where were you? What did it feel like when it hit? I read every single one of those, and honestly, they help me understand these events far better than any seismic report does on its own. So that's where we are. 2 separate strong earthquakes within a little over a week, on 2 different islands, tied to 2 different faults, both part of the same restless plate boundary that this entire country calls home. The volcano isn't waking up. The big one isn't imminent, but the ground underneath New Zealand is talking right now, and I think it's worth listening. If you want to understand the fuller picture, go back and watch the video I did on the Lake Taupo quake and the Kermadec Trench swarm, because this Taumarunui event connects directly into everything I laid out there. It's the same system, just a different chapter. I'll keep watching this with you, and the second anything changes, you'll be the first to know. 1 earthquake under a supervolcano last week, 1 earthquake right next door to it this week, both from the same stretching, restless machine underneath the North Island. That's the story, guys, the honest version, layer by layer. No exaggeration needed. Thanks for watching, guys. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one.